Okay, let's take a trip back in time, way back, about 3,000 years ago. The entire rulebook for how you get power was being torn up and rewritten. We're not talking about elections here. We're going to explore how ancient kings staked their claim, not with votes, but with incredible rituals, and how that one big shift created a social order that would last for ages. You know, today for a lot of us, power starts with something simple, putting a piece of paper in a box. But if you rewind 3,000 years, that whole idea was being turned on its head. A totally new, much more aggressive way to become a leader was taking over, one where power wasn't something the people gave you, it was something you took. So how exactly did you become a king or a raja in this new world? Well, you definitely didn't win an election. Nope. You had to prove your power in the most public, most dramatic way you could possibly imagine. And this, right here, is the big change. The voice of the jana, the people, was kind of getting drowned out. Instead, ambitious men started claiming their authority by staging these huge, spectacular public sacrifices. Power wasn't just handed over anymore. It had to be seized through a grand performance. And we're not talking about just any old ritual. There was one ceremony in particular that was the ultimate test of a would-be king's power and influence, the great horse sacrifice. It was called the Ashvamedha, and honestly, its design was kind of brilliant. This wasn't just some religious thing. It was a high-stakes game of political chess played out in the open. That horse wandering around? It wasn't just an animal. It was a living, breathing challenge, a claim to land and dominance. So how did this whole thing actually work? Okay, picture this. First, a special horse is set free to just wander for a whole year, and it's followed the entire time by the Raja's best warriors. Now, if that horse strolls into another king's territory, that king has a choice to make, and fast. He can either stop the horse and prepare for a fight, or he can let it pass, which is basically saying, yep, you're the boss. If the horse makes it back after a year without being challenged, it's sacrificed, and bam, the Raja's power is cemented for all to see. And that's the whole shift in a nutshell. You see the move away from a system where the Dramana, the community, had a say in their leader, to one where a powerful man forced his rivals to make a choice, all through this incredible show of military and religious strength. The result, it was crystal clear. A Raja who pulled off the Ashvamedha was now seen as the top dog, period. The other Rajas, the ones who let the horse pass, they'd be invited to the final sacrifice, but their role had totally changed. They weren't equals anymore. Now they were subjects, and they were expected to bring gifts to their new overlord. But a change this big didn't just affect the kings. Oh no. It sent ripples through everyone's lives. To justify this new power structure, a completely new and incredibly strict social structure was created. And the masterminds behind this new social pyramid were the priests, the guys who ran the rituals. They divided society up into 4 main groups called Varnas. It was a system where literally everyone had a specific place, a predefined role, and a set status from the moment they were born. All right, let's break this down. Right at the very top, you had the Brahmins. They were the priests, the ones who studied the sacred texts, the Vedas, and performed all the important sacrifices. Next up, the Kshatriyas. These were your rulers and warriors, the Rajas themselves. Then came the Vaishyas, who were the farmers, herders, and traders. And at the very bottom were the Shudras, whose job was to serve the other 3 groups. Now, there were 2 rules that really locked this whole system in place. First, your Varna wasn't something you could choose or earn. It was decided by your birth. If your dad was a Brahmin, you were a Brahmin. End of story. And second, sacred knowledge was power, and that power was guarded. Both women and Shudras were banned from studying the Vedas, which kept the social hierarchy exactly where it was. So, did everyone just accept this super rigid system without a fight? No way, not a chance. From the moment it was put in place, you could see cracks starting to form. People from all levels of society began to question the whole idea. And this quote right here, it gets right to the heart of the pushback. The main argument was simple, but it was revolutionary. A person's value and their place in society shouldn't be decided by the family they happen to be born into. The pushback really came from all over. You had some Kshatriya kings who were not happy with the idea that priests were ranked above them. A lot of other people just flat out rejected the idea that birth was a fair way to decide your status. Some even went further, saying there shouldn't be any social differences based on your job at all.
And really importantly, many people spoke out against the practice of untouchability, which created a whole other category of people outside the system, calling it one of the system's worst parts. And this resistance wasn't the same everywhere. It was especially strong in the northeastern part of the subcontinent. And that's probably because the priests and their strict social rules just didn't have as tight a grip there. It was like fertile ground for new, different ideas about how society should work to grow. So what we're seeing is more than just a new way to pick leaders. It was a fundamental change in a society's DNA, from choosing leaders to just inheriting them. And it leaves us with this really big question. What happens to a society? What do you gain and what do you lose when you decide that where you come from is more important than what you can do? You ever wonder how a small village, a tiny community, suddenly becomes a powerful kingdom? I mean, it doesn't just happen overnight, right? It's a whole process of settling down, growing, and totally transforming. Today, we're going to look at exactly how that played out in ancient India, about 3,000 years ago, and watch the rise of its very first states. All right, let's get into it. Our whole story really starts with this one simple but really powerful word, Janapada. Let's break that down because it's actually pretty cool. Jana means the people, the tribe or the community, and pada means foot. So a Janapada is quite literally the place where the people put their feet down and decided to settle. It's their foothold, their home base. And this is the launch pad for everything that comes next. And these settlements, these Janapadas, they weren't just in one spot. They started popping up all across the Indian subcontinent. Just take a look at this map. You can see how widespread they were. Each one was a little seed, a potential center for a brand new community. This was a huge phenomenon, and it was laying the groundwork for a completely new era. So, we know where they were, but what was it actually like to live in one of these places? I mean, what did they do all day? Well, for that, we've got to thank the archaeologists who've literally dug into the past and given us a window into their world. Dig sites like Puranakila in Delhi and Hastinapura near Meerut, they tell a really clear story. Life was all about farming. People lived in simple huts, they kept cattle and other animals, and they grew a whole bunch of different crops. The staples like rice and wheat, but also things like sugarcane and sesame. This was a settled agricultural society through and through. But archaeologists found more than just old farm tools and hut foundations. They also dug up this really specific kind of pottery. It's called painted gray ware. And listen, this was not your everyday run-of-the-mill clay pot. People who've handled it say it's super fine to the touch, and it's decorated with these beautiful, clean geometric patterns. And that detail leads us to a really fascinating idea. This probably wasn't the stuff you used for your Tuesday night dinner. The high quality, the unique style, it suggests it was special. This pottery was likely brought out for important events, for important people. It's a subtle clue that a social hierarchy, a class system, was already starting to form. So for a long time, you had these Janapadas dotting the landscape. But then, around 2,500 years ago, things started to shift. A few of these settlements began to get bigger, richer, and way more powerful than their neighbors. A huge transformation was kicking off. And this slide just perfectly captures that change. You have the Janapada, the people settlement, evolving into the Mahajanapada. That little prefix, Maha, it means great. And this wasn't just a name change, it was a total system upgrade. We're talking about great kingdoms now, complete with capital cities and, this is key, fortified walls. Right, those fortifications. They are probably the most dramatic, most in-your-face sign that a new kind of power had arrived. We're talking massive walls made of wood, brick, or stone, built around entire cities. Let's take a closer look. Just look at this. Wow. These are the remains of a wall from a place called Kaushambi, built about 2,500 years ago. This is not a garden fence, okay? This is a colossal structure. Imagine the planning, the resources, the sheer number of people it took to build something like this. It's mind-boggling. Which, of course, brings up the million-dollar question. Why? Why go to all this trouble? Why build these gigantic, resource-draining walls around your city? Well, it turns out there were a few big reasons, and they tell us a lot about this new world. First, the obvious one, defense. You've got other ambitious kings around, so you need to protect your city from attack. Simple enough. But second, these walls were a flex. They were a massive billboard screaming, "We are rich and we are powerful." And finally, and maybe this is the most important part, they were about control. A wall makes it really easy to manage who comes in and who goes out, and it helps a ruler govern the people living inside. Okay, so building these giant forts and then paying for big professional armies to defend them, well, that created a whole new set of headaches for these new kings. All of this stuff costs an absolute fortune. So yeah, who's footing the bill for all this? Where are the rulers getting the money, the food, and the materials to pull off these massive projects? The old way of doing things where people would just bring the king occasional gifts, that just wasn't going to cut it anymore. To fund these new, grand ambitions, rulers needed a steady, reliable stream of income. So they started collecting regular taxes. And this wasn't just a small change in accounting. This was a revolutionary shift in the relationship between a ruler and their people. And what's amazing is how organized they were about it. This table really breaks it down. Basically, everybody had to chip in. Farmers, the biggest group, paid a tax called the baga, which was a fixed 1/6 of everything they grew. A craftsperson? They might pay by working for the king for free 1 day a month. Herders paid with animals. Traders were taxed on their goods. Even hunters and gatherers had to give some of what they found in the forest. It was a seriously organized system designed to pull resources from every single part of society. So there you have it. The whole journey from a simple foothold, the Janapada, all the way to a complex fortified kingdom, the Mahajanapada, powered by a brand new system of taxation. A new era had definitely begun. And it leaves us with a pretty heavy question to think about. What does it really mean when rulers get the power to build walls not just to keep their enemies out, but also to keep their own people in? Ever stop to think about what it really takes to build a kingdom from scratch? I mean, not just the conquering part, but actually holding on to power and creating a state that lasts. Well, let's dive into it, because the basic mechanics of how the first states were built are, you'll see, surprisingly timeless. You know, today, a lot of us get to choose our leaders. Power comes from the people, from a ballot box. We decide who's in charge. But in the grand sweep of history, that's a pretty new idea. So let's rewind the clock, say, 2,500 years. You've just become a king, a Raja. Congratulations! Now for the tough part. How do you actually run this place? And maybe more importantly, how do you make sure you're still the king tomorrow? That was the million-dollar question. To figure out how they solved this, we've got to look at this huge shift that was happening in ancient India. Society was getting bigger, and with that new scale came a whole new list of problems. See, for ages, people lived in these smaller tribal areas called Janapadas, which literally means where the tribe puts its feet. But around this time, things started to change. Some of these settlements got bigger, way bigger, swallowing up their neighbors and becoming what we call Mahajanapadas, the great kingdoms. And you can really see that shift in scale right here on this map, as these new power centers pop up and expand. But bigger isn't always better, right? Bigger territory meant bigger problems, more people, more land to defend, and a lot more rivals looking at your shiny new kingdom. The new Rajas had to get organized, and they had to do it fast. All right, so problem number one, and it's a big one, security. How do you protect the heart of your kingdom, your capital city, your treasure, your people, when everyone wants a piece of what you've got? I mean, put yourself in their shoes. You've built up this thriving city. It's the symbol of your power. It's also basically a giant bullseye for every other ambitious ruler nearby. What's your move? Simple. You build. And I mean, you build massive walls. What you're looking at are the ruins of a fortification wall at Kaushambi from about 2,500 years ago. And these weren't just walls. They were absolutely colossal projects made of brick, wood, and stone. And these walls were so clever because they weren't just for one thing. They had like 3 main jobs. First, obviously, was protection from enemy attacks. Second, they were a huge flex, a way to show off just how wealthy and powerful you are. And third, they made it way easier to control who and what was coming into and going out of your city. But wow, can you imagine the sheer effort? This wasn't a weekend DIY project. We're talking about organizing the labor of thousands upon thousands of people, men, women, and even children, all to build these incredible defenses. Okay, so your capital's safe. It's a fortress. But your kingdom, it's a lot bigger than just one city. So how do you project your power beyond those walls? Right? That's the next puzzle. A wall can't exactly march out and stop a rebellion, or protect a trade route, or go conquer new territory. For that, you need something that can move. You need a force. Their solution? It was an absolute game changer. A permanent, professional, standing army. This was a totally different way of thinking compared to the old days, when you just called up farmers whenever a fight broke out. See, these guys weren't just farmers who picked up a spear when the bell rang. No, this was their full-time job. The king kept them on the payroll all year round, paying them a regular salary, sometimes with these new things called punch-marked coins. This meant he had a reliable force that was loyal directly to him, not to some local tribe. So you've got your massive forts, you've got your professional army. Awesome. But all this cool stuff, it raises a pretty huge question. Who's paying the bill? Yeah, the source material just nails it. When you're building giant forts and paying for big armies, well, you're gonna need a constant stream of resources to make it all happen. The old way of doing things just wasn't gonna cut it. The old way just wouldn't work. Before, a ruler might get some gifts, whenever people felt like giving them. You can't run a kingdom on maybe. So they shifted to something we're all very familiar with, a system of regular, mandatory taxes. And the absolute backbone of this new system was the tax on crops. I mean, it makes sense, right? Most people were farmers. They called it the baga, the share, and it was usually fixed at 1/6 of whatever you grew. And check this out. This table breaks it down so clearly. It wasn't just the farmers. Everyone pitched in. Craftspeople, they might pay their tax by working for the king 1 day a month. Herders paid with animals. Traders were taxed on their goods. Even hunters and gatherers had to contribute produce from the forest. Everybody paid. So when you step back and look at it all, these aren't just 3 separate ideas. Nope. They're all gears in one big, powerful machine. The machine that actually builds and runs a state. And this is what that machine looks like. It's this perfect, self-powering cycle. You build forts for security, you need armies for control, and to pay for it all, you guessed it, you collect taxes. But then, to enforce those taxes and protect your forts, you need your army. See how each part feeds the other? It's brilliant. And honestly, this is the big idea here. This 3-part engine, forts, armies, and taxes, it was basically the operating system for building a kingdom. And this basic code, this blueprint, was copied and tweaked and used by empires for thousands of years. It was an incredible system for building civilizations, for sure, but it completely changed the deal between the ruler and the people, from one of occasional gifts to one of constant required payment. So it makes you wonder, right? This engine built massive kingdoms, but what was the real cost for the ordinary farmer or the craftsperson who had to keep it fueled?
Today, we're going to dig into the incredible story of how one ancient kingdom, Magadha, got so powerful it literally became a superpower. It's a story that didn't just reshape a subcontinent, it actually stopped one of the world's greatest conquerors dead in his tracks.
So, let me ask you this. You've got a military genius, Alexander the Great, who has conquered pretty much everything from Greece to the edge of India. And then he just stops. What on earth could have been so powerful, so intimidating, that it made him turn back?
Okay, so picture this. It's 326 BCE. Alexander and his army are standing right here, at the River Beas. They have steamrolled through Persia, Egypt, you name it. But right here, on the doorstep of India, the whole campaign grinds to a halt. The reason why is all about the kingdom that was waiting for them on the other side.
To really get it, we're going to walk through the whole story of how Magadha got so strong. We'll start with a totally new kind of king, then look at the toolkit they used to build an empire, the farming revolution that paid for it all, and finally, we'll meet the army that put the fear into Alexander's hardened soldiers.
All right, first things first. We've got to understand that the world was going through a massive change back then. The very idea of what a king was and what a kingdom even meant was being completely transformed. You see, for the longest time, people were organized into nomadic tribes, the janas. But then they started to settle down, to put down roots. They formed kingdoms based on territory, called Janapadas. It sounds simple, right? But this idea that power came from the land you controlled, that changed everything.
And if you're one of these new kings, how do you show everyone you're the boss? Well, it wasn't about being popular anymore. To become a Raja, you had to put on a show. We're talking huge, public rituals like the horse sacrifice. This was pure political theater, a way of saying, my power is absolute.
So you have these new super ambitious kings ruling over their own lands. But ambition alone doesn't build an empire. You need tools, practical, powerful tools. So let's take a look at their empire-building toolkit.
Just look at this wall.
This is so much more than just a defense. Think about what it takes to build something on this scale. You need a ton of money, thousands of workers, and incredible organization. It's basically a giant stone billboard screaming, "We are rich, we are powerful, and we are in charge here."
And you can't pay for walls and professional armies with just occasional gifts from people. This is where the really powerful kingdoms, the Mahajanapadas, made a crucial leap. They created something we're all very familiar with today, a system of regular, organized taxes. And they didn't mess a trick. They taxed the farmers' crops, of course, but they also taxed craftsmen by making them work for the king 1 day a month. They taxed herders on their animals, traders on their goods, even hunters and gatherers had to give up some of what they found in the forest. Basically, every part of the economy was now fueling the king's ambition.
And they were very specific about it. The most important tax, the one on crops, was called the baga, and it was fixed at a sixth of whatever the farmer produced. For the first time, the state had a predictable, steady stream of money coming in. And with predictable money, you can make some very big plans.
Now think about it. If you're going to tax farms that heavily, you better hope those farms are producing a lot of food, right? Well, as luck or maybe genius would have it, a full-blown technological revolution was happening in the fields, and it became the engine for everything else.
Two things happened that were total game changers. First, farmers started using iron plowshares instead of wooden ones. This meant they could dig into that heavy, rich soil much more easily. Second, they figured out transplanting. Instead of just scattering rice seeds, they grew them into little saplings first, then planted them in the fields. The result? A massive jump in food production. But we have to be real about where this surplus came from. It was built on the backs of people doing incredibly difficult, back-breaking work. Our sources are clear that this labor was done by enslaved people and landless workers who had very little choice in the matter. It's the tough, often hidden foundation of these ancient empires. Okay, so we've got new political ideas, new tools for building a state, and a brand new agricultural engine. It's like all the ingredients for a perfect storm, and that storm landed squarely in one place, Magadha. This is how it became the first real superpower on the subcontinent. Yep, right here. Magadha was in the absolute sweet spot. In just 200 years, it went from being one of many kingdoms to the undisputed top dog. It's a classic case of location, location, location. Its geography was its destiny.
I mean, it's almost unfair how many advantages they had. They had major rivers for transport and fertile land, check. They had forests full of timber and, get this, elephants, which were basically the tanks of the ancient world. Oh, and to top it all off, they had iron ore mines right there to make tools and weapons. They literally won the geographic lottery. Now, resources are one thing, but you need ambitious leaders who know how to use them. And Magadha had guys like Bimbisara and Ajatasattu. These rulers were smart, they were ruthless, and they used every single one of Magadha's advantages to just go out and conquer their neighbors. And all of this brings us right back to where we started, back to Alexander the Great standing at the edge of that river. So what was the final product of all this change? What was waiting for him and his army on the other side? Well, the answer is right here. His soldiers. We're talking about men who had conquered the known world. They just refused. They said, nope, we're not doing it. And why? Because they'd heard stories, credible reports, about the army waiting for them, an army bigger than anything they'd ever faced, with huge numbers of soldiers, chariots, and the ultimate terror weapon, war elephants.
So here's the crucial takeaway. The army that stopped Alexander wasn't a fluke. It was the direct result of everything we've been talking about. The massive food surplus fed that giant army. The iron mines gave them better weapons, and the forests provided the elephants that made them legendary. It all came together to create this unstoppable force.
And that kind of leaves us with one final thought. The story of Magadha isn't just ancient history. It's like a timeless formula for how a superpower is made. It's a powerful combination of technology, resources, and leadership. And it makes you wonder, where else in history, or maybe even right now, do we see that exact same recipe at play?
When we think about ancient history, our minds usually jump to powerful kings and giant empires, right? But what if I told you that way back, over 2,500 years ago, a completely different and maybe more familiar idea of government was already happening? Let's dive into this world of kingdoms, kings, and a very early republic. You know, for many of us, this is how we choose our leaders. It's a scene we all recognize. Election day, people lining up, casting a vote. It's how we decide who gets to be in charge. But imagine you're living 3,000 years ago. No elections, no polling booths. So how in the world did someone become a ruler? How did you get to be king? Well, the answer is pretty wild. Okay, so let's take a look at how you would have claimed power back then. And believe me, it was a whole different ballgame. See, back then, you didn't win votes. You proved your worthiness, often through massive, elaborate public sacrifices. Power wasn't just political. It was seen as something almost divine. These men became known as rajas, or rulers. And the biggest, most important ritual of them all, that was the Ashvamedha, the horse sacrifice. Here's how it worked. A special horse was let loose to just wander wherever it wanted for a whole year. If that horse trotted into another king's lands and nobody stopped it, that territory was now yours. But if another king did stop the horse, that meant a fight. Pulling this off successfully basically made you the top dog, the undisputed king of kings. So this system of powerful individuals eventually led to something bigger, the rise of larger, more structured territories. These early territories were called Janapadas, and the name is actually pretty cool. It literally means the land where the people, or the jana, set foot and settled down. These were the very first real footholds of organized kingdoms. Now, let's fast forward about 500 years. As you can probably guess, not all of these settlements stayed the same size. Some of the Janapadas just got bigger, richer, and way more powerful than their neighbors. And these new, beefed-up kingdoms got a new name, Mahajanapadas. It just means Great Janapadas. Think of these as the first real superpowers of their time. This map here gives you a great sense of what was going on. You can see where all these emerging powers were. And see that big one right there, Magadha? Keep an eye on it. It's a major player. This was a time of powerful competing states, all vying for control. So what exactly made a Mahajanapada so maha, or great? Well, they had a few things in common. First, they built huge, fortified capital cities, partly for defense, but also to show off their power. They also had large, standing armies, and to pay for all that, they developed systems to collect regular taxes from everyone, farmers, traders, you name it. And if you want to get a sense of the sheer scale we're talking about, just look at this. These are the ruins of a fortification wall from that period. Building something this massive took an incredible amount of money, resources, and organized labor. It's a clear sign of a really powerful, centralized government. But here's where the story takes a fascinating turn. Because this story of powerful kings and their giant kingdoms, it isn't the only story. At the exact same time, a totally different idea of government was taking hold. So you've got these powerful kings building their massive fortresses and raising huge armies, all focused on expanding their own personal empires.
But in other places, people were trying something completely different. They decided to rule together.
So let's zoom in on a fantastic example of this. Vajji. Right next door to that powerful kingdom of Magadha we saw on the map, Vajji was a whole other story. It wasn't a kingdom at all. It was something called a Gana, or a Sangha. So what on earth does that mean? A Gana or Sangha? How did this alternative system actually work? Let's break it down. Okay, so a Gana or Sangha was basically an organization or an association. Instead of having one supreme king calling all the shots, they had many rulers. And we're not talking about a small council. In some cases, literally thousands of men would rule together. And get this, each one of them was called a raja. I mean, the difference is just night and day, right? In a kingdom like Magadha, one guy made all the decisions. Power was totally centralized. But in a sangha like Vajji, the many rajas would meet in assemblies to debate, to discuss, and to make decisions together. It was an early form of a republic. Now, it's super important to point out that this was not a modern democracy, not by a long shot. There were some serious limits on who could participate. Women, slaves, and landless farm workers were all excluded from these assemblies. This system was so unique and, frankly, so effective that it got noticed by some of the most famous people of the time. Even the Buddha, who actually came from Agana himself, had some thoughts on what made the Vajjis so strong. So, what was their secret sauce? Well, according to the Buddha, the Vajji's strength came from their process. He said they would continue to do well as long as they held frequent and open meetings, acted together in unity, followed their own established rules, and respected their elders. That was their recipe for a strong, resilient republic. So what happened to this incredible political experiment? How long could this kind of government possibly last when it was surrounded by ambitious kings who wanted to conquer everything?
The answer is pretty astounding, actually. These republics lasted for a remarkably long time. Despite being under constant threat, the Ganas and Sanghas survived for about 1,500 years. Yeah, 1,500 years.
But their incredible run did eventually come to an end. The very last of these early republics were finally conquered by the Gupta rulers, who built one of the largest empires of the era. So what do we take away from all this? The story of Vajji is this powerful reminder that a single king on a throne wasn't the only way to do things in the ancient world. For more than 1,000 years, an idea based on assembly, debate, and collective action actually worked, and it thrived. And that leaves us with a pretty big question, doesn't it? What can this 2,500-year-old experiment in ruling together teach us about how we govern ourselves today?